Hello, this is Albert Einstein. History myths fly around at the speed of light. Especially with that new internet thing you all seem to have. Thank goodness I have a direct connection to Professor Buzzkill, a fellow deep thinker who busts myths and takes names. I'm totally stoked. There's a new episode. I was stuck on this new equation anyway. E equals mc something. Something. Nah.
Yes, indeedy. It's Professor Buzzkill here, your famous history outlaw. And with me is one of our most popular history outlaws, one of the best buzzkillers ever, Professor Phil Nash from Penn State. How are you, Professor?
I'm doing great. Wait, so I'm not the history sheriff?
No, that's right. Sorry, that's right. No, you are the sheriff. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right. And I'll be the Walter Brennan sidekick. Today we want to talk about Jesse James and the whole idea of Jesse James as a Western outlaw and how it's much, much, much more complicated than that. But the most important thing is you're back.
Yes.
You're back.
And as good as ever.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yes, live and sexy here in the Buzzkill Bunker.
That's me.
Talking about the 19th century. So when you and I talked about possibly having a Jesse James show, I said something like, oh, that's right, because we never really do shows on the 1880s and 1890s, not realizing, because I literally didn't know, that Jesse James had been around a lot long before that, and had been in the Civil War.
Yeah, and that's going to be the thrust of my comment here. I think I'm here. This may be a bit of a straw man, but I'm assuming that a lot of people were like me, in that when you hear the words Jesse James, you think Western outlaw. Mm-hmm. You think a Billy the Kid type, a Butch Cassidy type,
right?
Someone who is basically, he's in the context of the West, right? The lawlessness and the gunslinging and the bank robbing and all that stuff. I never really looked into him. That was just my assumption, and I just sort of went on my way.
And most of that would be considered post-Civil War.
Exactly. Right. He's a post-Civil War and a Western figure.
Yeah.
And if you look into him, particularly, the book that we'll put on the Buzzkill bookshelf is a book called Jesse James, Last Rebel of the Civil War.
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating title, and that's what.
Right. I mean, I actually, if you wanted to put a bumper sticker on this talk, that would be it, right? Because it's a great book. It's by T.J. Stiles. It's been out a while. It came out in 2002. Mm-hmm. But that's, if you want, pretty clearly, if you want to understand Jesse James in context, like who he was and why he's important, it's not about the Old West. It's about the Civil War.
Okay.
Even when he is doing his most famous stuff, which is as a bank robber and a train robber.
Right. Which is after the Civil War chronologically. But,
right. Even that is also to be understood in the context of the Civil War.
Oh, okay.
And that you can't really separate them, because what he's doing in the context of robbing banks and railroads, a lot of what he's doing is continuing the Civil War and continuing to do what he did in the Civil War with the same people. In other words, and I don't want to overstate this, but it's too much to say there's this clean break between the Civil War and what he does afterwards.
Okay.
Which you would say for a lot of other people.
Yeah.
And in some ways for the country.
Well, it's not as if he's like one of these Japanese holdouts on an island. He's a famous Confederate holdout that goes on. It's not that extreme. But
no, not like that. But also you have to understand how he fought the Civil War, which was not really as a soldier, but in fact, well, we'll get into it anyway.
Right.
But yeah, so I mean, you have to.
More importantly than that, as you say, is the context and the geographic place that we're talking about.
That's right. In other words, it's not just about the Civil War, but also about Missouri in particular, which is his home state. Mm-hmm. So, just to set some of the context, people should understand that Missouri has this anomalous situation. It was one of the 4 border states.
Right.
In other words, it's a slave state that didn't secede.
Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and
Delaware.
That's right. Okay, West.
Correct.
East, yeah.
And I know it's a cliche, right, that the Civil War is literally a civil war. You got neighbor versus neighbor, brother versus brother. In Missouri, it's actually true.
Oh, I can imagine, yeah.
But Missouri, geographically, cutting across the middle of the state, west to east, is the Missouri River, which empties into the Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And that has a lot of fertile farmland that's good for the sort of large-scale agriculture that lends itself to slavery.
Right, okay.
So, in other words, you had anti-slavery parts of the state, like, for example, St. Louis was sort of a hotbed of abolitionism, interestingly, partly because of the large influx of German immigrants.
Oh, right. Okay.
who they weren't just any Germans. They tended to be liberal Germans who were fleeing things like tyranny and revolution in Europe. And so they end up in St. Louis, and these tend to be pretty hardcore abolitionists. A lot of them are going to fight in the Union Army. But then if you go, especially if you go further west in the Missouri River Valley, it's not really a valley, but the banks of the Missouri River, very strong pro-slavery areas, including in Kearney, Missouri, near the Kansas border, which is where Jesse James is born.
Okay, Kearney, Missouri. All right.
Kearney, Missouri. Yeah. So these are all the counties.
Hi to all the Kearney buzzkillers out there. Exactly. We're not holding you responsible for
among
Jesse
other
James,
things.
but
For me, this was a lesson in Missouri geography, which I was not very strong on. So these are all the western and central counties of Missouri. A lot of them, like Clay County, is where Kearney is. That's where Jesse James was born. So he. Near the Kansas border. So he was born to Robert and Zerelda James. Robert James was a preacher. Mm-hmm. The family were slave owners. They owned between 6 and 7 slaves. Prosperous hemp farmers.
Okay, now hemp is a very big deal back then because of cloth and paper and all sorts of.
Yeah, absolutely.
We don't think of it anymore as but it was huge.
But no, it was a huge sort of cash crop. So they were, and that's also, well, may allude to this later, but they're prosperous farmers, because later on you're going to have people imply that Jesse James is sort of a poor person fighting on behalf of the little guy, and that's one of the many lies that is going to be told about him. Yeah. So Robert James, the father, actually goes west for the gold rush in 1850 and dies there of illness.
Oh, right. Okay.
So Jesse James never really knows his father.
Huh.
He certainly knows his mother, and his mother is, as they would have said back in the day, was a pistol. She was, to her death, a very fierce, aggressive, ardently pro-slavery person. And she remarried twice. Her third marriage was to a dude. His last name was Samuels. But
dude.
Sorry, exactly. See, I'm using a Western term.
Historical terms. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, but and I mention that because that's important. So in other words, not only does Jesse James grow up in a slave owning family, his mom is sort of political and is an active promoter of slavery.
Oh, so he's getting us over the dinner table.
Exactly, right, absolutely right. So in other words, so that's part of his context. He grows up in a not just a slave owning household, but a very ardently pro-slavery household. And there's another Stiles makes another interesting point, which is about this sort of the geography of slavery,
right?
Which is in a place like Missouri, which is on sort of the edge of the slave world. Yeah, people are much more uptight about slavery.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Right. In other words, you don't feel as secure. Sure. You come in contact with many more abolitionists. Right. Or you feel more threatened, and then that leads you sort of to dig in your heels and to become even more aggressive.
Particularly if you hear about all these abolitionists in St. Louis, in your own state.
Right. Where, by contrast, if you're a slave owner, say in the Deep South, surrounded by hundreds of miles of
other slave owners.
Other slave territory, you're probably a little more secure. There, the difference might be in a place like South Carolina or Mississippi, where there's just an enormous slave population. Right. So you feel threatened in that way. So that's all part of the context here. So Jesse James grows up, owning slaves, basically being part of a slave-owning family, coming to understand that as the quote-unquote natural order of things, etc. And so that's important.
He took it in with mother's milk,
exactly,
if you will.
That's right. So we don't know actually that much about his early life. We know what's going on around him, once again, which is after 1855, which is when he's about 8, 9 years old, bleeding. The so-called bleeding Kansas breaks out right across the border.
Yes.
And this is the listeners probably know. This is about in a way, this is the Civil War starting before the Civil War,
right.
Where the territory of Kansas is being fought over by a lot of outsiders on both sides. A lot of pro-slavery Missourians left Missouri, went into Kansas to fight to make Kansas a slave state. These are so-called border ruffians.
Okay.
And then you had also abolitionists, some of them from far afield, who would do the opposite. People like John Brown, who people may know. He gets his start. He and his sons slaughtering 5 pro-slavery settlers with broadswords
Yeah.
So it's a look of things to come, unfortunately.
Yeah, he's known as John Brown of Kansas.
That's right. That's right. And so a lot of this violence that's in Kansas spills over into Missouri even before the Civil War starts.
Okay.
So
and that's kind of on the slave side of Missouri too, because it's on
absolutely,
the western side,
absolutely, right. And that's where a lot of these so-called border ruffians and those people who feel strongly enough that they think you have to have a slave state next to you if possible, and you're willing to fight for it. They're from places like Clay County. In Missouri. So, and then you have this struggle, this border ruffians versus Jayhawkers.
Oh, Jayhawkers.
Jayhawkers,
okay.
right? Which is why, right, it's the University of Kansas. Jayhawks.
Yeah, the Rock
to this
Chalk
day.
Jayhawks.
That refers to sort of anti-slavery or abolitionist
Oh, I didn't know that's where that came from.
guerrillas.
Okay.
And so you have guerrilla warfare, you have the sack and pillage of towns, you have slaughter of civilians going on in Kansas after 1855.
Wow.
And that goes on for years.
Yeah, we don't think about this as the dress rehearsal for the Civil War, but it sounds like it is.
In some, as I always tell my students, like, okay, it's popular sovereignty, the idea that you let a territory decide for itself, whether we're on slavery sounds great until the people decide to settle it with firepower.
Right,
And the Civil War in Kansas is going to go on for about 10 years.
Ouch.
Yeah, so that's part of this horrible context. And then in Missouri itself, as the Civil War looms, 1861, Stiles is very good about laying out the complexity that's not just a two-way civil war in Missouri. It's actually a three-way civil war in Missouri.
Oh, so it's even more complicated.
It's that one of the things that blew me away is just finding out how complicated this is. So you have basically these three factions. You have abolitionist unionists. So in other words, people in Missouri who want to keep Missouri in the Union but abolish slavery.
Right.
Later on, these are going to become the so-called radicals. Those are radical Republicans.
Okay.
Like further east.
Yeah.
Then you also have pro-slavery unionists, including in places like Clay County, slave owners who are okay with slavery and maybe even want to preserve it, but they don't believe Missouri should leave the Union.
Oh, that's an interesting twist.
Right? Absolutely. Yeah. And they are a big and influential group, and they're going to cause, in some ways, more problems for the third group, the secessionists, than the first group does.
Okay, so then the secessionists are both pro-slavery and secession.
Correct.
Do we know what Jesse James' mother was, by the way?
Oh, yeah, she's a secessionist.
Oh, okay,
so
absolutely. She's hardcore the whole
my God.
way.
She might as well have been an Alabaman. I mean, yeah. She's, she almost, I want to say zeal of the convert, which is not appropriate, but she would fit right in with John C. Calhoun and, the most... if she were in South Carolina, we would have called her a fire breather.
Oh, all right.
There's no question about that. But yeah, so
she
would be in this...
any other states, are the other border states divided three ways like this?
That's a good question. I would assume so, yes. Like a place like Kentucky?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I know
technically a union state, but still.
And, and Kentucky and Maryland, they supplied regiments to the Confederate Army.
Yeah.
And you had, and also we talked about this, look at the 1860 election where you have an entire, one of the four parties is the Constitutional Union Party. Though they take, what do they take? Virginia, they take at least one slave state, and they're anti-secession.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's all. I know it's a
group.
cliche, right? But there are always these layers. Anyway, so the war breaks out in 1861, and immediately this is like Kansas. It's a microcosm. Missouri you have a civil war within a civil war.
Mm-hmm.
Jesse James' older brother Frank, who will be part of the gang later, he's 18. And he joins the Confederate Army right away. And he actually takes part in some major battles like Wilson's Creek. Jesse James is only 13. So in 1861, when the war breaks out. So he might have been sort of a Civil War fanboy at this point. Sorry, another anachronism. But he doesn't take part. He's sort of, I don't want to say apprentice, but there are some points in this period before he actually becomes a guerrilla when he's a helper. And he'll load pistols and stuff.
Sure.
But
fetch and carry.
Exactly. Until he's ready to join the fight. But Frank is actually captured at one point and paroled and returns to the farm in 1862. But already you have, like I said, a civil war. Within a civil war, you have neighbor versus neighbor. And in a way, what happens next is explained by the fact that the Confederate Army itself loses the sort of conventional struggle for Missouri very early on.
Oh, okay.
The Confederate Army is basically driven out. They're going to return later in 1864. But really, the only pro-Confederate struggle thereafter in Missouri is waged by these so-called bushwhackers.
Right, these guerrilla sort of
Right,
backwoods
guerrilla
types.
irregulars, mostly young men who they're very, they're in some ways they're classic guerrillas, right? They do hit and run raids, they blend into the civilian population, they make use of the local public support they get, they hide in people's farms. After a raid, they'll scatter so that you can't hunt them down.
Right.
They'll move around seasonally, like they'll spend months down in Texas and then come back later. So they're very, very hard to hunt down. One of the most famous of these is a fellow by the name of William Quantrill, who, if people know their Civil War guerrilla history, he's a pretty big name.
If people know their Civil War guerrilla history, they're pretty well read. They ought to email us right away.
That's right.
We'll put them on the show.
As a matter of fact, I have a Bill Quantrill T-shirt. So, and he is one of the leaders of these so-called bushwhackers, the pro-Confederate guerrillas. But it's really important to understand that a lot of what they do is not against so-called Yankees. Okay. It's not against the Union Army, which doesn't have a big presence there. To the extent that they engage in real sort of warfare or combat, they're fighting against Unionist militia. Right. So, in other words, if you're a Missourian who joins the Union Army, you go and fight with Grant, or you go fight in another state. And security in Missouri is provided by, there was more than one of them, but there is provided by pro-Union militia.
Okay.
Right. And so the guerrillas will fight against Missouri militia. But it becomes in some ways the worst sort of guerrilla war, which we are more used to, say, in the 20th or 21st century, where you have not only insurgency, but counterinsurgency. And so, for example, the Missouri government issues this Government Order 19 in the summer of 1862, which basically forces people to pick sides. It basically says if you're an able-bodied
people.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, and so in other words, partly what I'm saying here is that this is not all on the Confederate guerrillas.
Okay.
That there's atrocity and there are misdeeds and there's abuse and there's tyranny from the other side as well. And basically you have this mutually reinforcing sort of escalation. And so this General Order 19, for example, there are others like it, basically say to able-bodied men in Missouri that you either join the militia or you'll be marked down as disloyal.
Okay.
And they're suspect of either being a guerrilla or a guerrilla sympathizer.
And therefore subject to arrest and
exactly,
capture
or expulsion or whatever.
Right,
exactly.
Right,
so in other words, they're basically saying you're either with us or against us. Mm-hmm. And by the way, there were some people who were trying to lay low, trying to sort of keep their nose clean, stay out of trouble. And this is essentially making that impossible.
Yeah, I can imagine there are a bunch of farmers who just say, look,
right, just leave me alone and let me make money.
Right. Yeah, I need to plant and I need to harvest.
Yeah, and that becomes increasingly impossible.
Wow.
So basically you have, especially after that, you have this pattern of escalating mutual atrocity. I don't want to do the both-siderism, because if you read about it, it's pretty clear that the bushwhackers do more of this sort of atrocity type stuff than the militia does.
But both siderism, we should remind people, is where there's bad on both sides.
Right, or because both sides do it, it's 50-50.
Yeah.
Right, whereas I wouldn't make that claim here. I'm just saying that you should not at all look at this as sort of good guys and bad guys, or one side with clean hands and the other side with dirty hands. There's more shades of gray. So you have, by atrocity, I mean, for example, the murder of prisoners, the murder of civilians. I mean, typical bushwhacker activity was to identify the homestead of some pro-union people, show up at the middle of the night, knock on the door, drag the dad out in the yard, and put a bullet in the back of his head.
Oh, God.
And then move on. And, all that was necessary was you IDing him as pro-union.
Even though he may have
never lifted a finger in anger, maybe never served in the militia, never helped the militia, right? He might have been one of these people trying to remain neutral. But if you ever heard third or fourth hand that he had said bad things about slavery or about secession, then he should be killed.
Holy cow.
So you murder, you rob from civilians, you steal livestock, you set fire to farmsteads. This is, like some guerrilla warfare, this is at the extreme end.
Yeah.
No holds barred. Basically, this is, a lot of it's not even combat. And I mean, there are times when if you read styles, there are times you're thinking, I'm not reading about guerrillas. I'm reading about a death squad.
Oh.
Where they're picking on what we'd call soft targets, right? In other words, you're going to stay safe if you just start taking out unarmed civilians. You're not going to suffer many casualties if you do that. And in your head, you're waging righteous warfare, but you're the member of a death squad. It's civilian murder is what it is.
This is not convincing me that Jesse James comes from a pure stock of the little guy fighting the big guy.
He's so much.
Yeah, it's a little bit murderous stock.
Right. No. So 1863, his brother Frank joins the Bushwhackers, and Jesse James, as I may have implied, tried to join but was rejected as too young. He's still 15.
Right.
He did, like I said, he did assisting work. They used these primitive 1836 Navy Colt revolvers that didn't use actual cartridges.
Huh?
In other words, to load these pistols, you basically put gunpowder and a ball in the chamber and then sealed the chamber with wax.
Oh.
And if you look, one of the first, if not the first photographs of Jesse James, he's a 16-year-old guerrilla, and he's got like 3 pistols on him. And that's because they would load all these pistols ahead of time. During combat, you couldn't reload them because it was so painstaking. So you would just use one pistol until it was empty, and then you grab another one.
That sounds almost 18th century.
It's pretty primitive. That's going to change.
Yeah.
But there's a theory because he blew off the tip of one of his fingers. And there's some people who say that he did that loading those revolvers.
Yeah, well.
They maybe got a little careless one day.
Yeah.
Anyway, by the way, that's one of the ways later on some people are going to be able to identify him. Like one of these guys was missing part of a finger.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's kind of hard to hide.
Exactly. Today we just use Photoshop.
Yeah, that's right.
But
DNA.
So there is this key point where Unionist militia come to the farm.
The James farm.
So the James farm. And during this incident, I won't go into the details, but basically they abuse Jesse James. They physically mistreat him, and they torture his father-in-law. They to get information, and because they're trying to find out where Frank is and his other bushwhackers. It's for information. But they basically put a rope around the father-in-law's neck and let him strangle him over the branch of a tree, and he almost dies. And the father-in-law and Zerelda are arrested, and we don't know for sure because we don't have good information, but there's a good reason to believe that for Jesse James, this is a turning point. In other words, if he weren't already going to become a vicious bushwhacker, this certainly fired him up, right? And so he's not just a bushwhacker, but he's got this strong revenge motive.
And there's every reason to believe he admires and looks up to his older brother.
Oh,
already.
Absolutely, yeah.
So
yeah, and he's being pushed in this direction by his mom at every turn. And now he's got this additional sort of personal vendetta, right?
Yeah.
That these militia people are evil and they're going to pay. So that's another thread that runs throughout his subsequent career, if I can call him that.
Yeah. So his role models, therefore,
absolutely right. So a lot of this is by inference, but it's pretty logical inference.
Right.
And in the same time, by the way, Zerelda continues to have kids, and she gives birth to a girl and gives her the middle name Quantrell. She misspells Quantrell's name, but it's clearly right. Name your daughter after the leading Confederate bushwhacker. That says a lot.
Yeah.
That's where Zerelda's head is. So 1864 is the year that Jesse James, now 16, joins the bushwhackers.
Okay, he's able.
So he is now. He's graduated. He has a certificate. He's now an official bushwhacker, and he's not fighting under Quantrill. At least not ultimately. He ends up in sort of a splinter group, run by someone who, if anything, is even more vicious than Quantrill. And this is a fellow by the name of Bloody Bill Anderson.
Oh,
people who are interested, Bloody Bill Anderson does in fact have his own Wikipedia page. He's an infamous guy, and this is where Jesse James gets his start as a bushwhacker. And right away, Jesse James we don't know exactly what he did on a given day in a given raid, but he was there as an active bushwhacker when they committed some of these atrocities. And some of the first actions he's involved in are about the murder of Unionist civilians.
Okay, so he's there
and taking part, yes, as a member of the death squad,
and still 16.
That's right. And so, once again, I mean, you mentioned role models. It's true. Now his role models include people like Bloody Bill Anderson. Another leading member of the Bushwhackers is this fellow named Archie Clement.
All right.
More on him later. But to say that these are sort of depraved guerrilla fighters is an understatement. Yeah. And so I'll give you one famous example.
And these guys are probably in their 20s, and so naturally, as a sort of gang mentality, he looks up to
correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely
okay.
right. Right. And and I'm sure you have the equivalent of sort of initiation rites
Yeah, the
and
whole
code
yeah,
of conduct and loyalty, etc. Absolutely.
And that's psychologically, that's almost impossible to overcome.
That's right. Especially when you are a young male, right?
Well,
Look at
yeah.
all the information we have now about how what is the prefrontal cortex not completely formed until you're 25 or so.
Right.
Okay, and he's 16. He is there and takes part in the infamous Centralia, Missouri massacre in September 1864. This is where Anderson's band intercepts a train. And on board the train, it turns out there's about 24 unarmed Union soldiers. So not militia, but actual Union soldiers who are returning home on furlough.
Oh.
From,
and that's why they're unarmed.
That's right. They're just travelers. But they're in uniform, but they're unarmed. So the bushwhackers take them off the train, line them up, strip them, and then shoot them all. With one exception. They keep one guy alive, either as sort of a warning or a hostage. I forget which. They also mutilate the bodies.
Oh.
They take scalps.
Scalps?
They take scalps, and I won't get into the details, but they do worse.
Oh.
And by the way, Bloody Bill Anderson, when he gets his in 1864 as well, he's killed by militia. They attached to his horse saddle, they find multiple human scalps.
Okay, this is obviously we've been heading down the road of explaining these people as barbarians, but they certainly are.
Right, and once again, context. I think most of us, it was certainly included me, something like scalping, we normally understand in the context of the Indian Wars.
Right.
This is white Protestants scalping white Protestants.
Right.
In fact, Missouri white Protestants scalping Missouri. I mean, in other words, this really is, internecine warfare like we can't even imagine.
And so by the way, not that I know this from experience or practice, but scalping somebody takes a while. You just don't zip,
right.
You got to actually
It's a deliberate
saw
act.
it off. And,
right.
It's a 5-minute
No,
process.
and they
at best.
did. I don't know how graphic you want to get, but they cut off some heads and swapped bodies and heads for a laugh, basically.
Okay,
after this
so these
event.
are real sickos.
Oh my goodness, yes. This is depraved.
And these are the people Jesse James is hanging
exactly.
out with.
And he takes part. He's not just standing around watching. He takes part. So the war ends in 1865, but in general terms, not for Jesse James and Arch Clement and folks like that. Anderson's dead. He's killed by militia in 1864. In May 1865, Jesse James is wounded.
Yeah.
I think it's for the second time. Another way they correctly identified the body when he's finally killed in 1882 is that his body has these 2 very prominent bullet wounds in the chest.
Oh, so they know that's
him. Right? He lived the rest of his life with a bullet in his lung.
Ugh. Yeah.
But he had a long recovery, but it's interesting. In this case, there's another myth later on. There's this myth of this long, multi-year recovery, and that's used as an alibi for some of his early crimes as a bank robber. They say, he couldn't have taken part in that
because he was
still recovering, and that's a lie.
Okay.
He recovered by 1866 and was ready to rob him some banks.
Okay, well, we're at 1866. The war is over, and this is probably a good time for us to take a little bit of a station ID break. We'll try to be a little less graphic in our description of where you can find the podcast, but we'll be back in a minute.
Hello, this is Antonia Buzzkill. Please support my daddy by going to ProfessorBuzzkill.com and clicking on the Patreon button. While you're there, subscribe to his email list and shop the Buzzkill bookshelf. Follow him on Facebook, on Twitter at BuzzkillProf, and on Instagram at Professor Buzzkill. Professor Buzzkill is part of Entertainment One's podcast network and is available on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and all major podcast apps. Please leave a review while you're there. Thanks for listening.
Okay, we're back with Professor Nash and with Jesse James, and I like having Professor Nash in the studio. You like listening to him, but I'm certainly beginning to feel I don't like Jesse James, and I certainly don't understand why everyone admires him. But anyway, the war's over, and so he's at least injured for a while because of this bullet in his lung. What else is going on?
Right. Well, because now we transition into big picture into the Reconstruction period.
Right.
Right, where the United States tries to put itself back together after the South is defeated in 1865. Well, and once again, just like Missouri was a microcosm of the Civil War in some ways, it's also a microcosm of Reconstruction, which is to say you have a struggle for power within Missouri between these various factions that I described earlier.
So it's not a two-way struggle.
It's a three-way struggle, or it's a two-way struggle asterisk. In other words, you have the main battle in politics is between different unionist factions. In other words, the two groups that were pro-union in 1861. One is the radical, sort of radical Republican. These are once again the people who tended to be abolitionists before. They want to reshape Missouri into a northern state, to put it very simply. Right, to make it more like Massachusetts.
Yeah. Okay.
And then you've got conservative unionists who want to sort of, obviously they know the slavery's gone, but they're more interested in preserving more of a Southern character to the state. Certainly not, like for example, partly we've got this agricultural industrial battle going on in the country, right? In terms of what who makes good people, right? And what do you want the character of your state to be?
Right.
The radicals are very much, sort of urban, industrial, finance capital, forward-looking in that sense.
And St. Louis being river-powered and everything is going to have a lot of new industry.
So and you're absolutely right. You do have some regional differences in the state, absolutely. But so you've got radical versus conservative among the former unionists. And then off to the side, the asterisk I mentioned. Off to the side, you have these sort of angry...
the asterisk party.
Right, the asterisk party. You've got these... Because they're really not a party, and that's part of the problem. Right, because the Civil War has been decided in that sense. And so these pro-slavery people are angry and alienated, isolated, have no political voice. But they still exist.
Yeah.
And they still exist in Missouri. So... then they're off to the side. They're essentially barred from politics. Part of Reconstruction in a lot of parts of the country, certainly in the South, is that former Confederates, especially high-ranking Confederates, weren't allowed to participate in politics. Like, weren't allowed to vote.
That's right. Sure.
Weren't allowed to run for office.
Yeah.
And so,
And
in
some
a
of them had
way,
to flee the country,
you have if you're a unionist, that's an understandable step. But you've helped create the conditions for the bushwhackers to continue doing what they were doing.
Yeah, because you have this resentment.
You've got the resentment. You've got the political motivation, but you haven't got the legitimate political outlet.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, they can't be elected to office. And
now it's not like Jesse James wants to put his pistols aside and run for
county commissioner.
Exactly, run for attorney general. But in other words, the environment is perfect for someone like him who wants to do what he has been doing.
Attorney general.
Vote James, attorney general. Yeah. Yes.
He gave
my
half
criminal
a finger
ways behind me. Yeah, a little unlikely maybe, but. Like in the whole South, even though the Civil War is over, the bitterness, the resentment, the desire for revenge and payback, or to put it another way, the desire to win the peace after you've lost the war, that's still there. That's there in Missouri like other places. There are other layers to this context that Stiles is very good about. For example...
Again, Stiles is the book we're talking about.
T.J. Stiles, Jesse James, Last Rebel of the Civil War.
And, of course, on the Buzzkill bookshelf.
And by the way, I'm not an official paid agent of his, just so you're curious, but I do highly recommend his book.
No, but wait. We had 2 envelopes of cash arrive, stuffed full of cash arrive with a return address.
Podcasting is not cheap, people.
To Professor Stiles' return address. Yes.
So you've got these other layers or other aspects to the post-Civil War, immediate post-Civil War context. One of them is technological in the form of the now mass-produced, relatively modern Colt revolver.
Oh, okay. So different from what he had to deal with before
because
the war.
If you look at sort of gun culture, if I can use that term, pre- and post-Civil War, they're very different. Like, for example, because of the war, companies like Colt start mass-producing modern cartridge-filled revolvers, which are not essentially different from the revolvers you might still see today.
Okay, and maybe the war accelerated the innovation,
right? The perfection of them, and also the cost comes down because now you're mass-producing them. And this is going to sound a little sort of left-wing conspiracy, but these big corporations are now also interested in keeping up sales afterwards, and they start marketing handguns to the public, which is not something they did before. No, and once again, not that Jesse James needs to be marketed too. He's a big fan already, but they're omnipresent. They're everywhere, and they're cheap. And a lot of men start carrying them around.
And presumably, I mean, Colt must be zillions of these things, and they've got to keep new employees. They got to keep production going.
Absolutely right. And so that's one layer. Another part of the context which I haven't mentioned, and this is not sort of primary importance, but it's part of the background, and that is, for lack of a better term, the whole concept of Southern honor.
Yeah, yeah. Which we
That,
talked
in
a little
fact,
bit about
I think
previous
Joanne
shows.
Freeman also talks a little bit about
Yes,
this.
that's right.
Right?
In her
In
new
other words,
book,
and in
yeah.
that sense, to the extent that Missouri is a southern state, you do have this sort of culture among adult men of southern honor, which is to say, you're very sensitive to public slights, and you're
Right.
not supposed to back down from challenges, etc. And that's another layer here. The basic story I think would have been the same even without this, but this I think helps fuel the whole desire for things like revenge. And
Okay.
for example, like, that's the militia officer responsible for Archie Clement's death or for Bill Anderson's death, so I'm going to go and get him.
Yeah, people often don't think about the post-Civil War, revenge and payback.
Right.
Because, as you say, especially in Missouri, it is neighbor against neighbor.
And it's personal.
And it's
right?
very
If
personal.
you're in the Union Army of
right.
the Potomac fighting against Robert E. Lee, you're not, I'm going to get Lee.
Yeah,
right?
no.
Whereas here, it's personal, it's small scale. You might have been neighbors for years.
Yeah.
You know them really well, and you
Yeah.
find out they stabbed you in the back or dimed you out to the militia or whatever. And in your head, you're like, you know what? Payback might be 10 years down the road, but it's coming.
Another anachronism. You said dimed him out. They dropped the dime in a payphone.
Drop a dime in the phone. It's going to be invented sometime. Relax.
Pretty soon. Don't worry, Jesse.
You've got other things to use your times on. So, in this early post-1865 period in Missouri politics, the radicals dominate at first.
Okay, again, these are the hardcore Reconstructionists who want to remake the South, have the South remade
Exactly.
almost as much like the North as possible.
They don't wait for national legislation. There are things they can do. In fact, they pass a new constitution in the state of Missouri that, for example, that not only makes official the 13th Amendment, gives black people the right to vote, bars Confederates from office, right? So, in other words, the radical vision of the future of Missouri is actually put in place. And that is additional motivation for, if I can use the term, for a bushwhacker backlash.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Well,
I should copyright that, but
that's what happens.
In other words, so they're not only aggrieved, but they're additionally aggrieved by post-Civil War events, not just payback for what happened before 1865.
And in theory, this, if there's retribution going on, that just keeps happening. You killed my father, and now I'm going to kill your uncle, and then it just it's never ending.
Tit for tat, correct. And so Archie Clement is by this point de facto head of the gang of these former bushwhackers, and they're all former bushwhackers, right? So they're all skilled horsemen. They're all very comfortable shooting people, very comfortable with firearms. They decide to get in the bank robbing business. And they do not choose just any bank. There is a Clay County bank, which is owned by radicals, which is their target, and that's why they picked that bank.
Oh, so they're not just in it for the cash.
Not just for the cash. They are in it for the cash.
Well, sure.
It's not like they go in there and kill the people and leave the cash.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
They pocket the cash and they use it and support themselves with it and always will going forward.
But they don't go after a Confederate-leaning bank or a slave.
No. And this, if I lose this thread, listeners should keep in mind that this is the thread that runs throughout this period of his activities, is that it is seldom random.
Okay.
Or it's, maybe that's overstated. Often there is this political motivation to it in terms of the nature of their crimes and the particular targets of their crimes.
Okay.
And then the way that they actually commit the crime. So, for example, in this case, they commit a murder and it's an unnecessary murder for the purpose of robbing the bank.
But because it's a radical bank.
Exactly.
It's probably tough for Buzzkillers now to think of banks as having different political views, but of course, if you're in Missouri, it may have been a lot of these banks are very modern, and industrial, and industrial money is put into them, and therefore it's a radical bank.
You know who owns the bank, and you know who are the big holders of assets in that bank.
Yeah,
that is obvious to everyone in the community.
Yeah, it's not a farmer's bank. It's not a bushwhacker's bank.
So we don't know 100% for sure whether Jesse James and Frank James were on hand during this. It's entirely possible. What I found interesting is that this very well may have been the first bank robbery ever in the history of the United States.
Really?
Yeah.
As late as this?
That was shocking to me. Stiles points out that you had attacks on banks.
Yeah.
But they tended to be burglary.
Oh, okay.
You break in the middle of the night.
Oh,
this is broad daylight. Burst through the door pull out your guns.
Wild West.
Wild West style, right?
All right.
You also before this you had all sorts of fraud.
Yeah, sure.
Con men, and you would rip off people and rip off banks that way.
But actually stick them up like in the movies.
This may well have been the first ever.
Wow.
So so there's another thread here, which is the history of bank robbery in the United States.
But again, also, I can't help bringing back to this industrialization because safes are now bigger and they're
Correct.
5 inches of steel and all, blah, 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 blah,
Right.
blah. So bank robbery needs to become more explosive, if you will.
Right, or more violent, or more military. Yeah, absolutely. So December 1866, Clement is killed by militia.
Okay, the leader of the
Archie Clement, who was by all accounts an unbelievably fierce, ruthless person. Who was, even though he was about 5 feet tall, he was super vicious and much feared. And they finally killed him. And Jesse James was clearly struck by this, very incensed, very unhappy, and wanted payback for this as well. But what it does is it clears the way for his rise within the gang, basically.
Oh, because he's now
which happens in other gangs too, right? Yeah, when the kingpin is off, right? Then you have other people who can move up in the pyramid. In 1869, Jesse James and his gang robs a bank in Gallatin, Missouri. And in the course of this robbery, he murders a clerk he thinks is the man who killed Bloody Bill Anderson.
He thinks is the man.
It's mistaken identity. He kills the wrong guy.
Yeah.
But by the way, it's
probably
unclear.
wasn't too upset about mistaken identity.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, no evidence he lost any sleep over it, or gave up killing after that. I didn't keep count, but I'm going to say that Jesse James, in his whole life, leaving aside the Civil War bushwhacking, so post-Civil War bank robbing, etc., he's got at least a dozen bodies on him.
Ugh.
I would say at least. We don't know for sure.
Yeah,
but it's not an insignificant number. So in other words, he's not just a bank robber; he's a murderer.
Right.
In
Okay.
other words, multiple capital crimes. So, like I said, this is part of the pattern, right? In other words, he's not just robbing a bank. He picks the bank and tries to kill the person he thinks wronged him. In effect,
he's trying to settle the Civil War score.
Settling scores from the Civil War.
Right.
Then, after about 1870, he becomes much more of what we recognize him as today, which is to say, not just a bank robber, but a legend and a symbol.
Okay, and by the way, he was what 25-ish?
Yeah, he's still super young.
I know.
Now he's what? He's like 23.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now he's an old man compared to when he was a bushwhacker at 16. Yeah. No, it's crazy. He's gonna be 34 years old when he's killed.
Oh my goodness. Talk about cramming a lot into a life.
Right. Absolutely. So after 1870, he becomes, like I said, very influential and widely known. And not just because he's robbing banks.
Okay.
That's going to bring some notoriety, especially since bank robbing is so sort of sensational.
Yeah.
But he today we would say he acquired an agent. It's not that formal, but largely through the strenuous and long-term efforts of a particular newspaper editor, Jesse James becomes famous. And becomes known as being a better person than he really is.
Oh, okay.
There's this former, and it's another former Confederate, not coincidentally.
Yeah, okay.
It's a former Confederate, in fact, former Confederate guerrilla, I believe, by the name of John Edwards. Mm-hmm. And he's an editor of 2 or 3 major newspapers, including at one point he's high up at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Oh, which is still going.
Yeah. So he's relatively prominent. He's got a today he'd have his own website. He's very prominent. Has a big reach in Missouri politics. He has a lot of readers. He's very influential.
Yeah.
And the two of them very quickly establish essentially a symbiotic relationship.
James and
Edwards. John Edwards. Edwards will publish James's letters to the editor.
Oh, okay.
He will do his own sort of op-ed pieces where he's basically singing Jesse James's praises.
Wow.
And the editor himself becomes more prominent sort of because of his promotion of Jesse James, right? That helps him
almost always works that way.
Right, that helps him get readers, etc. And he helps establish Jesse James's martyrdom. In other words, he starts to establish Jesse James not just as a public figure, but as a victim.
Oh, okay.
In other words, like poor Jesse James, he's been persecuted by the law, by radicals. Why don't they leave him alone?
Yeah.
In other words, not only defending him, but basically inverting the story. Like, only is he not a bad guy, but he's actually, why don't you leave him alone?
Now, do they actually say that the stories of his murders and everything are exaggerated or untrue?
Yeah, that's interesting because that becomes this sort of core hypocrisy at a lot of this promotion.
Yeah,
which is Edwards will write op-eds in which he basically, not in so many words, says, you should support Jesse James. He's fighting for you, But he hasn't actually done any of these robberies you've been reading about in the newspaper.
Oh God.
And then, in other words, in this like cognitive dissonance, right? In the same sentence, these two things that could not both be true.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
If he's fighting for me, how is he doing that if he's not robbing banks and killing people?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, is he like, I don't know, selling magazine subscriptions? I mean, what is he doing, right?
So Edwards doesn't even try to do a Robin Hood thing where he's stealing from them.
Correct. Yeah, the Robin Hood is not directly from Edwards. That's going to be although he I don't know for sure. He may help promote. He certainly wouldn't have opposed that. Maybe he was bummed that he hadn't thought of it himself. But on James's part, it's important to understand that very quickly James himself becomes a publicity hound.
Oh, okay.
So he becomes interested in promoting himself and shaping his own image, and he really enjoys it. He enjoys being a public figure. He enjoys reading about himself in the newspaper. He enjoys taking part in that process. So in a way, Edwards is not his agent. Jesse James is his own agent.
Right. Wow.
He starts to believe his own hype.
Yeah.
And Edwards will publish things like, he does this more than once. He basically says James would be happy to surrender to the authorities, but he'll never get a fair trial. So he can't do that.
Okay, so it's again sort of an anti-establishment,
exactly,
anti-new
right?
order.
And once again, it established like his victimhood. Like he's a good guy, wants to do the right thing, but the big bad authorities won't let him.
And presumably, the public or the readers of Edwards' newspaper are just eating this stuff up.
Oh, absolutely.
It fits into their already sense.
Fits into their own sense of victimhood. Absolutely right. And so, and like I said, he becomes a symbol, and he's a symbol for, once again, aggrieved ex-Confederates.
Huh. Okay.
So there's actually one point where Edwards publishes an op-ed piece, and the title of it is, and I'm quoting, "The Chivalry of Crime."
The chivalry of crime.
The chivalry of
word crime,
which, based on everything I've just said, is the perfect John Edwards bumper sticker.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. This is okay, I guess. Right, because you make him seem like a sort of a modern, like a cavalier, right? like a knight.
Sure. Yeah.
And sort of fighting for you and fighting against the evil people who unfairly crushed us in the late conflict.
And playing off that Southern sense of chivalry and lost cause sense of chivalry.
Right. Yeah. Exactly right. And so even
these people were really thinking this through.
Oh, absolutely. No, in some ways it's brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is really well played. I mean, you have to give them that. And so even more so than before, former rebels rally around Jesse James, and I should start saying Jesse James in quotation marks, right? In other words, who they think Jesse James is and not the real person. Jesse James asterisk, I guess you could say. And that's important too, because after crimes, they will disperse. They'll be hunted down by the authorities, and so they'll need, I'll use the term Confederates, they'll need people to help them, right? Hide them, refuse to give information to the authorities. Did you see Jesse James come through here? Oh, absolutely not, even though you
it's
did.
Hot in your barn.
Right,
yeah.
exactly.
Right.
So, in other words, that the PR campaign serves that purpose as well.
Right, okay. Wow.
So by 1871, I left out one other thing, which is Jesse James, he gets married and has a couple of kids.
Or how he has time to do this.
Right, yeah, and it's that's another sort of subplot here, which is really interesting double life he leads when it comes to his home life and his wife, who he tries to keep her out of it, and then I think she basically doesn't want to know where the money comes from. I think he actually gave her a ring that he had stolen from a passenger he held up on a train. Right?
A used ring. You would know
how to say
not
I love you. Yeah.
I stole this for you, honey.
Exactly. This is from the heart. So this is, I thought this was, speaking of symbolism, I thought this was perfect. So he had his first son, he names Jesse Edwards James.
Oh, after the...
And could that be more perfect? I'm going to name this kid after myself because it's all about me.
Yeah.
But in the concession to my promoter, I'll give him the middle name Edwards.
John Edwards, the publisher. Yeah.
Yeah. And wow, it's like, if he didn't think this out, he should have, because this is perfect. It's absolutely perfect.
It's just we're joking and we're laughing here, but it's amazing how much sort of natural self-promotion seems to flow from.
Yeah,
him.
I mean, in a way, he was ahead of his time, I think.
Yeah.
Today he'd be taking constant selfies.
Yeah, and while he's killing people, so
right? Exactly.
Remember, we are revolted. By him,
right. Here's me with my revolver pressed against the temple of a bank teller,
stealing this ring. I'm going to give it to my wife.
Exactly. Yeah. So by 1871, you have something you would call the James Younger Gang, which is to say, Jesse James, Frank James, and the three Youngers. This is Cole
These
Young.
are other
Right.
guys
These are other
named
former
Younger?
bushwhackers. This is Cole Younger, Jim Younger, and Bob Younger.
Right.
So there's 5 of them. They also always have other people. It's not just the 5 of them. They've got this sort of secondary cast of characters, but all former bushwhackers.
Wow.
All consider themselves completely reliable. They commit more crimes. They move on from banks to railroads.
Right.
And then this becomes another layer in the myth because railroads, once again, context, Gilded Age America,
Industrial.
railroads. Wasn't there a book called The Octopus about
Yes,
the
that's right.
railroads?
It goes
Right.
out. Yeah,
Right. In other words,
across
people
the
started
country.
hating the big modern corporations, and the first of those were the railroads.
Yeah.
Right. They were shafting the little farmer on shipping rates, and they were sometimes ruthless, and they were all powerful.
They're taking your little farmer money and funneling it right to New York.
Correct.
Right.
There's a sort of parasitic
That's
relationship.
where that octopus thing, so the head of the octopus is in Wall Street.
Right. And so the minute they start robbing trains, you've got people who interpret this as, oh, thank God Jesse James is sticking it to the man, basically.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Which is not at all his intention. As Stiles makes very clear,
no.
they're actually not even robbing the railroads. They're robbing the express companies who use the railroads to transport money and valuables.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right? In fact, it was interesting for years, the railroads themselves, they really don't care. They're not interested in hunting down Jesse James or putting a stop to this because it's not really affecting them that much. It's affecting Wells Fargo.
They're passengers.
And passengers, yeah. And they don't always do that, but once they start holding up passengers, they're certainly affected. And of course, it's relatively well-to-do people who travel on trains.
Right, the shippers. Yeah. So
It's the shippers, the express companies, who are separate entities. They are very unhappy, and they're the ones who start hiring Pinkertons to start protecting and protecting the loot and hunting down very unsuccessfully the robbers. But it's really important here that this becomes a layer in the myth of Jesse James, ascribing to him a motive that he doesn't even have.
Right.
Like he was not like, how can I stick it to corporate capital? That's not what he's thinking. That's not his thought process. Trains are in some ways much easier to rob because what you do is you go out to a really isolated section of track.
Wait for them to come by.
Not near any town. You park your horses, you block the track, the train has to stop, you get on, you rob it, and you get away. It's much easier than robbing a bank.
Which is in the middle
as
of a
we'll
town.
see in a minute.
Right.
Yeah. So there's more basically lies being layered on top of lies here. All of the efforts to track down the Younger gang fail, and some of the attempts are pathetic. Even though the Pinkertons had this great reputation, they will send, for example, they send one Pinkerton agent to Clay County to hunt down the Jameses, and he's basically in public making it clear that that's what he's there for.
Well,
and then the Jameses kill him.
Yeah.
They grab him in the middle of the night, they shoot him. Yeah. So there's a lot of ineptitude here. Later on, there's a Pinkerton raid where they surround the family farmstead. Frank and Jesse are not there at the time, but Zerelda and other family members, including some young children, are there, and they throw an incendiary device through the window to set the place on fire, so that people are basically smoked out.
Right.
Well, this incendiary device is picked up by someone in the house and thrown into the fireplace. And then it goes off like a bomb and kills one of Zerelda's young children, whose name is Archie, not coincidentally. Right? Not after Archie and Jughead, but Archie Clement. And that, once again, that then becomes triggers a new wave of outrage and sympathy for the Jameses, right?
Yeah,
Look how vicious these Pinkertons are. Look what the poor James family is up against, right? How vicious they are. And so that, once again, makes it even harder to hunt them down. There are a lot of cases where witnesses are intimidated, not surprisingly. And Jesse James and his people, let's just face it, are very, very clever. They're very elusive.
Yeah.
They're very good at evading law enforcement. Keep in mind also that, you notice I said Pinkertons and not the FBI? Well, it's because there is no FBI.
That's right.
And when you're engaged in sort of, if you're engaged in an interstate crime in this period, law enforcement is just not equal to the task. It just isn't.
No.
And there are also, by the way, there are some local law enforcement people, some sheriffs and judges who are just intimidated. I don't want to go up against these guys. They're killers, and they're much more likely to get the drop on me. And so I just rather not carry out this warrant that's been put on my desk.
That's the attitude I would have.
Yeah. And so they have this sense of impunity going forward. By 1875, Missouri is quote unquote redeemed.
Now, what is it? We always hear about this redeemed and
that,
redemption.
That,
what does
that
it mean?
is a pro-Confederate term, basically means when the radical Reconstruction in a given state is removed, when former Confederates, including former Confederate officers and generals, and white supremacists are put back in charge of a given state, that state has been quote unquote redeemed.
Right. Brought back into the chivalrous
South.
South.
Right. In other words, made a quote unquote capital S Southern state again. And so-called scalawags or carpetbaggers, quote unquote, are no longer in charge. And and this, we talked about this in that other show. This is going to pave the way to Jim Crow and segregation and all, and so that nightmare.
And redemption is such a strong word; it's such a biblical word.
Exactly. Yes, and once again, in this period, very religious age, people always portray what they're doing as God's work, etc., or use biblical terminology. So Missouri is redeemed. In other words, former rebels, the more pro-Southern, the more conservative wing of the Unionists, and in some cases even former rebels, are now back in charge. They changed the laws, including the Constitution. Stiles argues very strongly that Missouri, as of 1875, has more of a Confederate character than at any point during the Civil War itself. In other words, they've actually, in a way, not even turning back the clock isn't right. They've so thoroughly vanquished the radical forces in politics that you wouldn't even recognize the state.
Holy!
They also, I love this. They pass an amnesty for any crimes committed by bushwhackers up to August 1866. So, okay, people know they're chronologically more than a year after the end of the Civil War. You've got people who are, the Civil War is over, but because they're bushwhackers, we're going to give them a pass on anything they did, including murder, including bank robberies, etc.
Wow.
They also, I love this, they establish a limit on rewards. Which is not a very subtle way of essentially sanctioning Jesse James's criminality, right? Yeah. Because the only way you're going to overcome, say, witness intimidation is by offering a big fat reward.
Right.
And the rewards are capped at I think it's like $300, which is a lot more than it is now. But it's not enough to motivate someone to risk their life. Exactly. So they're basically saying, the government, we're going to protect you, James Younger gang members. Now, the problem for the James Younger gang is that by this point, they've started to outlive their usefulness, right? They were part of this outsider, bushwhacker, pro-Confederate force in the state. Well, they've won now.
Yeah, that is a new tradition.
Right.
So.
We don't need to rally around Jesse James anymore. We can rally around the state legislature because those are all our people now, or at least the majority is.
Holy cow. God, that's
so
complicated.
Right? Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it is amazing.
Right? It's like, so as a sort of a cultural figure and a rallying point, we really don't need him anymore. It's like we've achieved our goals. We've ex-Confederatized the state already.
Holy cow.
And the problem for him is that he doesn't get the memo. And
Edwards doesn't send it to him.
Exactly. That I don't know. That must have gotten lost.
Move with the times, buddy.
Right. Post office was primitive. And he continues his work. And then there's this big turning point, which is in 1876.
Yeah.
He and his gang launched the famous Northfield, Minnesota raid.
Oh, what? No, Minnesota.
Minnesota. So in other words, they have to go all the way through Iowa and up into southern Minnesota to rob the bank there. Now, if people are wondering, okay, why Northfield, Minnesota? Yeah. Once again, it's all about the Civil War. There was one of the most prominent of the radical Republicans in the Reconstruction South was a fellow by the name of Adelbert Ames. Mm-hmm. He was a Union general, very successful and prominent Union general. Later on, he's going to get the Medal of Honor, actually.
Oh, wow.
And he's very active in post-Civil War Reconstruction politics in Mississippi. He's both in Mississippi. He
himself is from the north.
Correct. Yeah. He's from the Northeast. He is at one point U.S. Senator from Mississippi and also governor. And he's very aggressive. For example, he believes in black equality.
Right.
And he makes sure that black people in Mississippi, where there are a lot of black people, by the way,
sure,
they can outvote white people if they all get the right to vote. He ensures that they get the right to vote. For years before 1876, he is notorious among former Confederates as sort of someone you love to hate. Okay. He's really well known, and Jesse James is not well educated, but he follows politics. He reads all the newspapers. He's up on events.
Yeah,
he liked to discuss politics with people. Sometimes before his robberies.
Has Ames then moved back to Minnesota?
And that's the rest of the story. Yeah, he's
okay.
actually he's essentially driven out of Mississippi as part of their redemption.
Oh, okay.
And he decides to sort of pack in the political thing, and he goes back to the family business in Northfield, Minnesota.
Okay.
And in Northfield, there is a bank where a quarter of the bank is owned by the Ames family. That's why this town and this bank is chosen as a target.
Wow.
So this is 11
really
years. This is 11 years after the end of the Civil War.
Yeah.
And if this is just about money and living nice and that you can't get a legit job or whatever, you would pick another bank. Or you
in Iowa.
Yeah,
which is closer.
exactly. You would do something else. And then, by the way, they put a lot of preparation into this. They scouted the town. They drew maps of the town or got maps of the town. They scouted their escape routes, etc. So they've targeted this for political reasons. This is it's a bank robbery, but once again, he's basically still fighting the Civil War.
This is
still fighting Reconstruction, even though Reconstruction is ending nationwide in pretty much in the same year.
This is very eye-opening about the Jesse James image.
Yep, and his motivation. Yep.
Yeah.
So September 1876, they rob the bank, and it goes horribly for the gang.
Oh, the gang. Oh, okay.
This is where the gang is essentially destroyed.
Ah.
Most of them make it out of town. Some of them wounded. 2 of them are killed during the raid. And what happens is their method was when you decide to rob the bank, you come in on horseback, firing your guns in the air, and everyone scatters and goes inside, and then no one gets in your way.
Oh, well,
that was their MO.
Yeah, okay.
And it worked.
Yeah.
In this case, everyone fled inside and they got their guns.
Oh.
And so it's not a ton of people, but just enough people flee indoors, get their guns, and then come back to the windows and start opening fire on the bandits.
Yeah, that puts a crimp in your plan.
And also they're like trapped out in the open against this bare brick wall on the side of the bank,
exactly,
and they're taking fire from multiple angles. There are townspeople who are killed or wounded, but 2 members of the gang are killed outright. And by the way, you can go online, you can see pictures of the bodies where they prop up the head and you can see the bullet hole in them.
Because
that's how
the townspeople are kind of proud of the.
Yeah, that happened a lot. It's going to happen when Jesse James dies, by the way.
Yeah.
Back then, they loved taking early photographs stuff. Yeah. And all the youngers, by the way, they make it out of town but are captured shortly thereafter, like a week or 2 later. One of them
but obviously
wounded.
Jesse is not shot.
Jesse and Frank barely escape.
Okay.
They go through an ordeal that lasts weeks where they're escaping sometimes with no food for a couple of days.
Oh, so this is like a Butch Cassidy runaway. They're
it's protracted, and there are posses everywhere.
Holy cow.
It's a tribute to their toughness and their resilience and their sort of doggedness that they make it out of there and escape. But this is the end of the James Younger gang. Because all the younger survive, but they spend years and years and years in prison after this. Okay. And props to the townspeople of Northfield, Minnesota. They were a lot more effective than those Pinkertons were. That is for sure.
There to the towns, the local towns militia.
Right. Yeah. No. It's a big part of southern Minnesota history.
Now that's 1876, and certainly one of the most famous dates in American history is 1877, and because
the end of Reconstruction.
Ends.
Right, that's when Confederate redemption is made official and is made basically nationwide or across the South. The 1877 is when the last federal troops are removed from the South,
and so that even strengthens the idea that Jesse James starts to lose his usefulness as a popular icon.
In a way, he's kind of a dinosaur. He's past his heyday, but he's now at the point where he can't find it in himself to give up a life of crime.
He can't go work at the shoe store.
Right. Which is interesting. His brother Frank does.
Oh, really?
In fact, his brother Frank basically he becomes legit. Basically, they both move partly to flee the law. They both end up in Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And, for a while anyway, they got plenty of money, but Frank basically becomes a working stiff and loses all interest in bank robbing. Now he's going to reluctantly go back with Jesse James and actually take part in a few more crimes later on. But he's lost his taste for it. Jesse hasn't.
It tries to fly right. Yeah.
Right. Jesse he's very quickly bored with a legitimate lifestyle.
Yeah.
He spends a lot of his time gambling money away, which is one of the reasons he has to take up robbing again, is because even though he had a lot of money. And by the way, some of these robberies, some of them were basically busts. But that first one in 1866, the haul was enormous.
Oh,
it was
really?
the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money.
Oh, okay. So you can live off that for a long time.
Yeah. Even if you're dividing it among your buds,
gang,
they always. A lot of the raids, witnesses said these guys had the best horses I've ever seen. They were really well dressed, like even fashionably dressed.
Huh.
They had beautiful brand new revolvers. I mean, they did not. They didn't put this in their 401k. They did not hesitate to flash their money around.
Right.
Which is why, by the way, like in Northfield, there were some people who were suspicious of these guys who claimed to be cattle buyers or whatever,
who were scouting
the town out. It's like, what are these guys really up to?
They look a little bit too much.
Yeah, and then they found out the hard way.
Yeah.
So they're dinosaurs, but Jesse James can't give up crime. The problem now is that he has to have a gang. And he can't put the old gang back together
because half of them are dead.
So, and this is essentially going to explain his demise, because he's forced to rely on associates who were not bushwhackers.
Yeah,
they're young. They're not. He doesn't know them well enough. They're not reliable. They include, for example, people like Charlie and Robert Ford.
Yeah.
And so Jesse James goes back to Missouri. And by this point, the situation has changed, not only because is the state redeemed, but we have a new governor, Thomas Crittenden, who is more interested than anyone else in putting a stop to Jesse James and his antics.
Oh, okay.
And this is largely for what you and I would call business reasons.
Huh.
He is concerned that the presence of James, his notoriety, the threat that your bank or train might be robbed, is putting a damper on the economic development of the state.
Yeah,
which is probably true. By the way,
that's right.
Because remember, Missouri is trying to lure migrants from further east, trying to lure investment capital,
money,
and you want to create a nice business environment. You can't have that. So
with all this promotion and publicity, that's
right. Exactly.
Against it.
Exactly. Absolutely right. And that you can't control. So Crittenden actually sits down with all the heads of the railroads, not the express companies, the railroads, and basically leans on them hard to pony up really large reward money
to fight to hunt down
Jesse James. He's basically had enough, and he is willing to pull out all the stops. He actually meets with Bob Ford. Charlie Ford had actually taken part in robberies with Jesse James. Some of Jesse James's last robberies. Bob Ford, not so much.
Okay, so these are the two new guys.
These are the two new guys, and there are other new guys too. And there's a lot of complicated details I'm leaving out. If people are interested, they could watch a fairly recent movie called The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford.
Oh.
Coward Bob. It's got Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck.
Well, there you go.
It's actually a pretty good movie, and gets a lot of the atmosphere right about this, and some of the events right. I'd have to watch it again, but it's actually pretty good. One of many, many movies about Jesse James, by the way, part of the problem. But Bob Ford basically makes contact with the governor and basically says, "I'll do it, and you give me the reward money."
I'll do it.
Yeah, I'll kill Jesse James.
Oh, okay, all right. I'll turn on him and kill him.
There's a long period of several months where Charlie Ford and Bob Ford know that they're going to kill Jesse James when they get the chance.
Wow.
The problem is they don't always get the chance, and they're dealing with a very dangerous customer.
Oh, sure.
For example, getting him separate, because Jesse James is increasingly suspicious of people during this time.
Yeah.
So he's very paranoid. It's part of the problem. He's almost never without his guns. Getting the drop on him is very, very difficult.
Right.
But basically, long story short,
himself with bodyguards. Yeah.
Right, or other people with guns who are loyal to him. He moves his family to St. Joseph, Missouri, a little farther north of Kansas City, once again on the Kansas border. And in early April 1882, there's a moment in the parlor at Jesse James' house where they're sort of hanging out, and Jesse James puts his guns aside and goes to clean some dust, I think on a clock or a mantle or a picture or something, and Bob Ford shoots him in the back of the head. And he's killed instantly.
So a little housekeeping did him in.
Exactly. The fact that he was
Of all things, yeah.
He was apparently pretty fastidious. By this point, by the way, he has a long beard that he dyes black. If you go online, you can see it in the picture of him lying on the slab, and you can see the scars. Right, he's stripped to the waist. So you can see his bullet wounds, so they know it's him. This was essentially. I don't necessarily approve of the way this was done. This was essentially state-sanctioned murder because the Fords were on the same day arrested, indicted for murder, tried, convicted, and pardoned.
All of that happened on the same day?
On the same day.
So the governor can say, well, we caught him and convicted him.
Right. Anyone else can say, wow, the governor's responsible of murder, which is kind of what it, right? In other words, you go ahead and kill him and I'll pardon you. That's murder for hire.
Sure.
In essence. Now, they had
accessories
to split.
Before the crime. Yeah.
Right. They had to split the reward money with a bunch of other people. Mm-hmm. The movie is very good about this, that the Fords became notorious themselves. A lot of people condemned them for what they thought was a cowardly act.
Sure.
They actually...
Because the poor man's dusting. You can't shoot him while he's dusting.
Right. Or why didn't you call him out and have a duel with him, right? Yeah. Right. This is cowardly. And this shows up in the movie too. The Fords actually went on the road doing sort of a vaudeville style reenactment show, and I wish I were making that up, but that's true.
This is just so disheartening about human nature.
Right. And Bob Ford himself, Charlie Ford kills himself a couple years later.
Yeah.
Bob Ford ends up running one of these temporary mine camp saloons out in Colorado, and some random dude comes in off the street one day and shotguns him to death, presumably as payback for having killed. It's sad and pathetic in so many ways, but once again, I love this way of sort of capping off the story. When in St. Joseph, Missouri, word spreads that Jesse James has been killed.
Yeah. And
by the way, they're very careful to positively ID him, because immediately there are people, they didn't really kill him. That's not him. He's still alive. You'll never get him, right? That kind of like Elvis is still alive kind of stuff.
There's a grassy. Elvis is still alive.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to offend you.
That's a buzzkill. You're touching a nerve there.
But this crowd gathers out in the street in St. Joseph, Missouri, and they start chanting, and I'm quoting, "Hurrah for Jeff Davis."
Hurrah for Jeff Davis.
As in Jefferson Davis, former president of the Confederate States of America. In other words, the way I interpret this is, even if we have lost track of who Jesse James really was, even people at the time didn't, right? They understood him.
Okay, yeah.
Right? They understood him as this was... Right, this guy, he's a jolly good fellow, right? He was fighting for us, i.e. the Confederacy, and how sad that he's gone. Long live Jeff Davis. Right, of all the things you could have chanted upon finding out that Jesse James is dead, that's what comes out of your mouths.
And Jeff Davis is certainly out of the country and may be dead by now.
Let's see. No, he's still alive. In fact, his book had just, maybe that's why, his book had come out. Remember, we talked about this. Jeff Davis's book is like one of the first shots fired in the establishment of the Lost Cause myth,
of course.
Which comes out in 1881.
And by the way, we're talking about Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy.
Right. But so even some of Jesse James's presumably not very well-educated fans understand him as essentially a Civil War figure. Wow. Not as a Western outlaw.
This is just completely new to people like me.
And then later, so to get a little bit into the historiography, later some historians, including people like Eric Hobsbawm, are involved in spinning. Well, spinning is a little unfair, but they interpret James as either sort of a social bandit,
right,
or as a Robin Hood figure, or as someone who's striking a blow, sort of a version of a Luddite. In other words, like striking a blow against modernity, right, on behalf of the old agricultural ways against the modern faceless corporation, the railroads
and the banks with their big
right,
safes.
or he's sticking up for the poor people. Just recently, I saw what I would seem to be a pretty reputable website talking about Jesse James, and they referred to him as a Confederate soldier, which is also giving him too much credit.
Yeah, because he's a
bushwhacker. At best, he's a guerrilla. At worst, like I said, he's a member of a death squad.
Yeah, okay.
So there's all these myths that go on and on and on. There is an incredible amount of popular culture devoted to Jesse James.
Yeah.
There are, in the silent era, they make movies about him, not just in our time.
Oh, right.
There are a lot of pulp fiction and comic books and
serial fiction,
serial fiction and dime store novels about him, and he has this massive presence.
And a lot of these things are just made up.
Absolutely, a lot of them owe more to John Edwards' view of things than to, say, historians' view of things.
Right, the Edwards, the publisher, of
the
St.
publisher,
Louis,
right. So in other words, a lot of the hype, a lot of layers of myth making survive well into and through the 20th century, which is one of the reasons why I think this podcast and that book are so necessary, because we're sort of and the idea. I mean, there's, by the way, just for the record, not a shred of evidence that he ever redistributed a single dime of his proceeds.
Right.
Just never.
Right.
He and his people kept it all, spent it all.
Sure.
There was one during one of the later robberies. We don't know for sure who. One of the robbers walking up and down the train cars they were ripping off the passengers basically blurted out, "We're stealing from the rich and giving to the poor." And apparently that sort of took hold, and that word got out that's how they saw themselves, right?
Yeah,
exactly. He was
taunting,
exactly. He was just wisecracking. But that may have been part of the fuel for the Robin Hood myth. But he was not a Robin Hood. The way, like I said, just to sort of recap, the way to understand him is he's a member of a vicious death squad. He's a murderer and a robber who's continuing the Civil War long after it was over.
I think the death squad thing is so important because so much of the gang idea is romanticized, and when we think, when you just replace the word gang with death squad, that makes it a lot more.
But it's a lot right. It's a lot right. It's much harder. Much harder to romanticize.
Right. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and I would put it in part of the larger picture, which we see today all the time, which is we glorify all sorts of mobsters and gangsters and drug dealers.
Absolutely.
And look at, for example, the fascination with a movie like Scarface. Well, both versions, but certainly the one from the 80s. Why for a second would you, even as a half joke, identify with someone like that?
Yeah, no. These are awful people.
Yeah. And I would put Jesse James in that context. In other words, part of this larger puzzle of like why we continue to not just be fascinated with. I mean, you can be morbidly fascinated with Jesse James because he is morbidly fascinating. But the idea that you would then try and believe myths about him, or like he's a Robin Hood, or he's a bad guy, but look at all the good he's doing, like we're trying to like mitigate some of his crimes, to me is just amazing.
Yeah. Well, it is amazing, but it's one of the things about this period is the number of amazing, myths and reinterpretations we have, because this is a glorification of something that didn't happen with Jesse James. Then you have a glorification of the Old South and the Lost Cause decades, and on and on and on. It just seems to never end. It's really, there's never any denazification period like you had with the Nuremberg trials after the war.
I think it's an excellent way of putting it. Absolutely.
And we need it. And then that's why we have this show, by the way. The
Fighting for truth, justice, and the American way.
The Jesse Jamesification of 19th century American history.
Right. Well, and also, and just one last thing, just also the geographic refocusing of the story.
Yeah, right.
That this is not, his crimes we don't know for sure, may have taken as far east as Huntington, West Virginia.
Yeah.
And mostly we're in places like Missouri.
Yeah. And we think of it as Nevada.
Right. Now,
Utah,
keeping in mind, in fairness, keep in mind that back then the Missouri was the West for a lot of people.
Oh, sure.
But in the larger context of U.S. history, this is not fundamentally or even secondarily a Western story. This is a Southern story.
Wow. Well, there you have it, Buzzkillers. Just remains for me to say thank you, Professor Nash. It's great to have you back. It's always illuminating and eye-opening. And of course, as we say, we've put Professor Stiles' book on the Buzzkill bookshelf for all of you to rush off and get. And we'll talk to you next week.